But was Carter different than the next guy? No, because he did the same thing. And then the Republican after him, and then the Democrat after him, they all did the same thing. And while they give the appearance with their dark, hidden, acting ways, they're all pushing the same agenda forward, which is one world control.
Welcome to this episode of the Sharpening Report. I'm your host, Sam Johnston. We're found on YouTube, iTunes, Spreaker, and you can follow me at Twitter at SamTJohnston. Well, in our pursuit of truth, we cover many different topics, and there are a lot of different people looking at many different pieces of this puzzle that form our reality. And it causes us to dive into many different topics that maybe some of us aren't comfortable. Well, if you're not comfortable talking about a certain topic, then it's even more reason to dive into it. And today, to talk about this pursuit of truth and these maybe a little obscure topics, we are joined by researcher and radio host Crrow777. And I'm really excited to have this conversation because he has been doing this for quite a while and has many great guests on his own show that talks about, again, just pursuing the truth. So without further ado, Mr. Crrow, how are you doing today?
I'm good, and thanks so much for having me. And by the way, I think we have a friend in common. I noticed that Wayne McCroy was on your channel.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Wayne and I had a really good discussion, and that's actually how I heard about Wayne. It was through your program, so I'm excited to have you on.
Hey, I'm glad to be here.
So before we kind of get too much into topics, can we just get a little bit of a background on who you are, where you came from, and how'd you come across the name Crrow777?
All right, I'll take the name first. I don't know how aware your followers are about what happens to us all in this country and many others when we're born. Our name is turned into a corporation, which is referred to the straw man. The name Crrow777 is a play on my birth corporate straw man name. Each of the three names I was given has 7 letters in it, so that is the root of Crrow777. I'm sorry. Oh, and you asked me how did I come to be known online? It all started back in 2012. I had quit working for corporations, consciously decided I'm not doing this anymore. It was 2007, 2008, and I started just shooting with a camera and a telescope. And by chance, on the equinox of 2012, the fall equinox, I shot what's come to known as the lunar wave, and I held on to that footage and a bunch of other footage that I'd shot through the scope for about a year. And in 2013 I began to upload all the things I'd shot, and it just exploded from there.
Interesting. What brought you to try to film the moon, just out of curiosity?
Well, there's a story to that too. So in 2012 on the supermoon, which I believe was in May, I had my nephew over and I had my telescope out for the first time in quite some time. And we didn't have a way to film. We were just using the eyepiece, and my nephew yelled, Uncle, there's black triangles going over the moon. And I thought, boy, he's lucky. I'll never get to see that. And fate would have it, over 2-3 hours, these black triangles just kept transiting between the end of my scope and the moon. My brother-in-law, quite a few of us saw it. So the next day I was out getting the things I needed to be able to film. I was thinking, boy, I'll never be so fortunate to see anything like that again. But anyone can go to my channel on YouTube, Crrow777, and just see the endless things that I filmed. As a matter of fact, my co-host on Crrow777 Radio is Jason Lindgren, and he's produced a movie that covers everything that happened from the filming of the lunar wave up. That movie is called Shoot the Moon, and we're planning to release it on April 5th of this year.
Yeah, definitely something to look forward to on that front. So let's talk about, I'm sure we've piqued many people's interest with the lunar wave. what can you give us? Can we dive into that a little bit? What does that mean, the lunar wave, and what kind of conclusions have you've come to after years of thinking and researching on it?
It's not easy to tell you certainly what the lunar wave is. I think over 30 people have filmed it now. It's been filmed twice in front of Jupiter. For people who haven't seen it, it looks a bit like if you took an old tube TV and filmed it with an old VHS camera, that rolling wave that you would get, it looks like that. It looks like the moon is refreshing. And for people who have followed me some years ago, I announced that space is likely liquid. I've said endlessly, or tried to demonstrate endlessly, that the space agencies exist to ensure we know nothing about what's over our head. And I've further stated that there is a hard, fast boundary. I think your audience may think along these lines. Biblically, that would be referred to as the firmament, but also biblically, it is stated that the waters are separated from the waters. Possibly the lunar wave has something to do with the hard, fast boundary and the liquidity of space, but these are hard things to prove.
Very interesting. So we're kind of alluding to this construct that we live in, and how things are really, it's just difficult to find the truth. And one thing that you constantly say on your show is we live in a construct. Can you kind of expand on what that means a little bit? Is there any sort of truth that we're being fed from anywhere, or I guess what's your opinion on that?
Well, since about the year 2000, so many people, their minds were coming online. They were waking up. The old nonsense that we'd accepted for so long, for so many decades, was no longer good enough, and we began to question things. And we do live in a construct, but that's largely to do with what we choose to believe. And I'll state for this audience particularly, so everybody understands, one of my taglines has been, belief is the enemy of knowing. In no way, shape, or form is that a shot at anyone's religious beliefs. What's that stating is what we're talking about here. If you choose to believe in a thing, it's very hard to unbelieve it, and you just accept it in your mind. You never challenge things. So with the powers that be in this world constantly misdescribing things, lying about things, large numbers of people end up accepting those misdescriptions and lies, and that leads to the construct where we think we know things about this place when actually we've just decided to accept half-truths, lies, misdescriptions, these types of things.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that, and I definitely don't take it a shot at any religion. It's something that I say on this show is, if you believe something but you've never put it to the test, then why do you even believe it in the first place? Like, you have to know why you believe something, or you are just being, you're just setting yourself up for deception. So I can really appreciate that that line of thinking. So we kind of touched, in the construct and talking about things like the lunar wave, is what is the point? Why would they lie to us about what space is, or what the moon is, or what's the point there?
It keeps us all living in a state of fantasy. And not only that, you could make simple deductions like, if you don't know where you exist, how can you possibly know where you can go from here? There's all kinds of logic we can apply to this. But if you consider back in the day, if there was such a time in this world when kings and queens ruled, what you're looking at is a small family, maybe, 20, 30 people in the royal family there. And what they're doing is controlling a huge mass of people. And that's never really changed. Kings and queens have come and gone. We've come into the modern age with governments, but still this fantasy-based reality is used as a means of control. I guess that's the simplest I could state it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so is it just control for the sake of control, or is there some sort of end game, in your opinion at least?
Well, I would imagine that a lot of people in your audience are interested in becoming higher spiritual human beings. The lies that we're told and the scientism that is so rampant these days are all designed to keep people low. We could maybe analogize it to children. Children believe in a lot of things that aren't real. And in some ways, that's what makes them children, right? As they grow up, they begin to realize Santa Claus isn't real, or any number of things, and they start to grow up. If we apply this to adult human beings, it's a similar thing. All the adult human beings that have been convinced to believe in fantasies and things that are not real, they're being held low, and they're being spiritually prevented from growing up, for lack of a better description.
Interesting. So when trying to find out what is in our reality and what is actually going on, one thing that I've always, after listening to your show, I've always wanted to ask this question is, what do you base truth off of? Is it only the empirical evidence around you, or is there some sort of, can you look into someone else's research without actually knowing who they are, or what's truth based off of?
That's a heck of a question, and that is one of the problems with all the kind of noise that goes on online. For my part, I don't surf the internet hardly at all. I do almost all my research out of books. Now, my co-host, he does use the internet, but to answer your question, what I try to do is boil things down to their most basic constituent parts that I can think of the most simply. One of the rules that I use is there's no lie in nature. So the idea that the creator, or however this place got here, is synonymous with nature. It's a perfect system, right? From our point of view, nature appears to be perfect. There's no lie in nature. If I'm out in the world and I learn something by observing birds in a tree, there's no lie in that. I don't have to question it. I understand it is what it is. To get back to the main part of your question, I use a lot of direct observation. And one of the primary rules that I always employ if I'm trying to determine if something is true or not, the first question I try to discover is this natural, or is it made by men? And so you can see the process that I'm trying to apply here, boiling it down very simply, having foundational ideas like there is no lie in nature, and I work from there. And then a big part of it, a huge part of it, is common sense. In the modern era, so much of us have been convinced that so many fantasies are true that our common sense doesn't work the way it should. And not only that, for people who are further along the spiritual path, they've grown up a lot spiritually, there's a whole other insight that comes into things, but maybe that's not so easy to talk about, because spiritual insight is not easily communicated to another human being that's not at a similar level.
Yeah, that's definitely very true. So there's no lie in nature. That's really an interesting idea. Obviously, people. So how do you reconcile something like this? So if two people go into an experience and they come out with different observations, how does that fit into that idea?
That's the nature of being a human being. Each of us are unique. Each of us have given gifts, right? Some of us are good artists. Some of us are good speakers. Some of us are very good at mathematics. So this is the benefit of humanity, where we all can get together and add our different strengths. But unfortunately, part of the fantasy-based reality we're living in, one of the social training ideas that's gone on online is to get people to fight about things. Like, if I don't agree with what you're saying, then we can't communicate because we're going to fight about it. This is social engineering, and what it's designed to do, this is case in point for the fantasy-based reality. If we weren't programmed into these fantasies, we could look at that other point of view and hopefully learn something or come together and further whatever we're trying to do. But the social engineering, the construct, the fantasy-based reality tries to convince us that we need to be at odds. There's a lot of that going on with gender right now in our world, where the social engineering is using media and movies and gender in general to sow the seeds of discord. And that is, there's the fuel for the fantasy-based reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I really appreciate you coming on this show. We obviously have very different backgrounds, and I think some of our beliefs are definitely different. So I appreciate just this opportunity to kind of go against that effort to try to divide people and segment society, which is, I've been listening to some of your interviews, and another thing that you say that they do to try to prevent people from reaching truth is cut down variety. Can you explain a little bit about what you mean by that?
Right. So if a small group of people with power is going to try to socially engineer and control a large group, the enemy of the people trying to exert control is variety. And we can see that we can prove this all day long. So one of the things social engineering seeks to do is reduce variety. One of the examples I've used recently is think about cars. I'm over 50 years old. So when I was young, there were all these different varieties of cars and all these different colors. And when Ford brought out the Mustang, Chevy responded with the Camaro, right? Direct competition going on there. And then Dodge came out with maybe a Challenger or a Charger. And there were even special colors like Challenger Purple. A lot of variety back then. If you go out on the roads today and you begin to look at all the colors of the car, you'll see predominantly most of them are grays and whites, and even the blues and reds are muted. But another thing is evident. If you were to go out and look at, say, the class of vehicles that is like a Hyundai Santa Fe, that kind of, everyone's familiar with that class of car. Yeah. But when you look at the design of it, and then you look at BMW's version, and then you look at Chevrolet's version, they all have a similar look. The variety is being engineered out of the system, and that's just one example. And so in short, the social engineers try to reduce variety in a system, which makes it easier for them to control it.
I guess, can you expand a little bit on why more variety would be a worse thing? I mean, because if you're trying to fill a society with lies, then you would want a large variety of options for people to choose. Am I missing the point?
No, it's kind of like you're describing, but I would suggest it's the opposite. So if we know a lot of people are religious in this big group, all right, then we know that we can probably engineer them using religious ideas. If we know there's another group over here that say all Republicans or all Democrats, and that's a large group, we can use ideas that fit with that construct. Very, very few people are aware that the entire idea of Democrats and Republicans was put in place by social engineers. Anyone listening to this can go look up a speech that was given in this country in 1924. And I'll do the backstory here. There was a guy named Norman Montague, or maybe it's Montague Norman, I forget. One of the two. I'll call him Norman Montague. Maybe I have that backwards. He was the governor of the Central Bank of England. Now, the Central Bank of England is the model that was used to put the central bank in here. And as so many people know, the central bank is the center of most of the miseries that we live with these days. But to get to the point, Norman Montague comes in 1924, which you can look up this speech that he gives to all the bankers of the United States. And in that speech, plain as day, he says the following: there's a political party in this country made up of Democrats and Republicans, and we've successfully implemented this, and now we will use it to ensure that they endlessly argue about things of no importance. This is case in point about reducing variety. The truth is that a human being on their own is so complex that being a Democrat or Republican is ridiculous. To stuff a complex human being into this box of someone else's ideas. And not only does it segment them down, all of a sudden they start to believe what everyone else in that group believes. They quit thinking about what they truly think is correct. So those are examples of the idea that I'm trying to express here.
Yeah, so it's like collectivism over individualism. So it's forcing people into certain groups. You can definitely see that in every aspect of society, even the part that we kind of dwell in with the fringe community, trying to find truth and maybe some conspiratorial aspects. Is once people hear an idea, they kind of fit into a group, and they stop doing research or even looking any further. When I'm sure we both know that once you get involved with a topic, you can really go down some rabbit holes, and before you know it, you're the only one that believes something.
That's right, but that becomes problematic, and that too is social engineering. So many conspiratorial ideas people can get involved with, and that is why I always make common sense paramount. There was a video not too long ago where we were asked to believe that all these mountains that look like tree stumps were once these giant trees made out of silicon, and that gained a lot of popularity online. What I pointed out was that if we just apply common sense, that's an unacceptable idea. We have no example of a tree that's 10 miles tall, right? So common sense dictates from the get-go that this should really be questioned and challenged. And yet what we actually saw was so many people wanted it to be a reality that they just decided to believe in it. And we say constantly on the Crrow777 radio podcast, challenge everything we're laying down. Everything. There's not a thing that we cover that you should not be challenging, trying to poke holes in, try to rip it apart, apply common sense, do all these things. It's critically important. And this gets back to the idea of saying, hey, I'm a Democrat or Republican. That's where common sense flies out the window. That's where the complexity of a human being, or maybe the talents of that human being, start to get lost. Because if they just remained their normal self with all these complex ideas each of us has and these unique talents, and then each of us apply these attributes to any given question, I think we would be doing a lot better as a whole.
Yeah, definitely. It does make it an interesting strategy when trying to help truth prevail in our society. Is the collective group mentality is such a strong force that it's hard to move into that. So as someone who thinks individually and thinks for themselves, how do you stand up against something like that seemingly unstoppable force of a collective mentality as an individual? How does one stop that?
Well, that too is social programming. There's no rule or law in this world that says I can't have unique ideas, and yet the social engineers have tried to make it a problem. If I think a unique thing and this whole big group comes against me, the average person will fold and say, okay, my idea is not so unique and I give up. I'll just accept what you guys have in your big group. The truth is that every human being is complex and unique, and they have abilities that their neighbor might not have. And some of us have incredible abilities. And so to surrender that to the group mentality, that too is a form of social programming and another way of removing the variety of the talents of individuals.
Yeah, true. That's a good point. So kind of going back a little bit, you said you had fundamental ideas that you live by. One was there's no lie in nature. Can we hear a couple more of those? That sounded really interesting.
Common sense should always be the first step. And for those of you that are old enough and you remember what was called the greatest generation, which would be my grandparents who are no longer with me, the social engineers of this world, places like the Tavistock Institute, flat out wrote in documents that generation was going to be the hardest to socially program. The reason they cited was because they had not been raised on television. So a short 3 generations later, we have groups of people who have been wholly affected by media. And so part of what's gone on there is this whole fantastic, unbelievable world has become believable for a lot of people. They've thrown their God-given common sense has been chucked out the window. Their grandparents had it. To some degree, their parents had it. But by the time we get through all this television and media and the control systems that are put in this world, generations later, we're completely programmed. And so common sense is always my bedrock. If I can't just look at a thing and apply common sense and find something acceptable about it, I'm already in doubt that there's any value there. Understanding that we live in this creation, however it got here, and from our point of view, it appears to be perfect. If something needs to happen in nature, let me tell you something. It'll happen, and it'll happen without fail when it needs to happen. That's a system no man can duplicate. And part of what we see going on now is the people in charge want to be gods of this system. We refer to them as Luciferian quite often. And the reason for that is they can't be gods of this system. They can't create things that are so perfect as nature. But what they can do is create technology and scientism and artificial things made by men. And when there is 5G everywhere in this world and a smart meter on every house and every person's carrying a cell phone and every car is GPSed and everything is tracked and monitored, then to some degree they can in fact be gods of that artificial system. And that's kind of what's gone on here. And that's kind of the whole game that we're pushing against. We want to value the creation here. We don't want an artificial man-made substitute. It's a pale comparison. So at the root of everything that most of the truther communities are seeking, there's your foundational basis for what's gone wrong and what we're pushing against.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with that. That is so true, and it just seems like it's a war on people's creativity, ability to express themselves. Like you said, with TV in every house and a cell phone in every hand, you're constantly being fed ideas into your brain, and you don't have the opportunity to use your brain and be creative and change reality for yourself, as in going out and making things become what they're supposed to be. So yeah, that's a great point.
You know, we live in a world of marketing, and anyone who wants to apply common sense can instantly understand that marketing at its root is dishonesty. It's manipulation. It's what modern marketing is. As a matter of fact, most people probably are not aware. Do you have any idea why we eat bacon and eggs for breakfast in this part of the world?
Yes, I do, but go ahead and tell a story.
So there was a man named Edward Bernays who probably changed this part of the world in more profound ways than anyone else we can point at. He was the double nephew of Sigmund Freud. And he was approached by, I think it was the pork industry, with a problem. They had all this surplus pork. How could we get people to buy it? Well, at that time, way back, early in the 1900s, most people ate 2 meals a day, lunch and dinner. As a matter of fact, it is stated in ancient Rome that if you broke your fast or had breakfast before noon, you were a glutton. They only had 2 meals a day. But the marketing put forward by Bernays convinced everybody, with doctors making statements like a heavy breakfast is good. Instead of having a piece of toast and coffee, which was a typical breakfast, we got onto this whole thing where all of a sudden it's bacon and eggs and pancakes, and that was completely social engineering brought to us by Edward Bernays. As a matter of fact, Edward Bernays is responsible for women in this country beginning to smoke cigarettes. Back in the day when men smoked, it wasn't socially acceptable for women to smoke. Well, Edward Bernays dealt with that as well and made it perfectly acceptable and then mainstream for women to smoke. And you'll see the complicit nature of Hollywood in all this. Anyone can go back to see the films pushing the ideas of the programming that the social engineers are bringing to bear. And for that matter, a similar area, whatever it was, 5th Street or whatever it was in New York where the marketing firms were, they are also responsible for Christmas as we know it now. And I would defy anyone to show me how Christmas has any religious attribute left in it. It's basically wholesale materialism. It's what it is. Not only is it wholesale materialism, it socially engineers us all to treat our children badly. We lie to our children to convince them that this guy dressed in red that comes down your fireplace, hint, 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 is real. And then we reward them for belief in that with gifts. And then at some point, those children grow up and realize that that was a lie. There is no Santa Claus. But then what do? They do the same thing with their children. This is social engineering in spades. And it all came from a similar place in New York. Very few people are aware that the way we eat breakfast, the fact that women smoke in our society, Christmas as we now see it, these were all marketing projects from social engineers.
Yeah, you won't get any argument from me on the whole Christmas thing. There's a lot of special people in my audience. They don't appreciate what Christmas is, and even a lot of the traditions come from pagan pagan ideas and different religions, so like that, and even going further on the social construction, looking at how Star Wars is so popular, you can see that's one of the first movies ever to have those trailers produced and to be mass produced with different different toys and things like that. And so that even goes even further into what you're saying as just another point of the way marketing is designed to make people think a certain way. And you can even go back into what we started off with space and how people can view space through movies like that.
Well, repetition is a form of marketing. It is a form of programming. If you're exposed to a thing often enough, it becomes commonplace. And there are so many examples of this. Look, when I was young and Leave It to Beaver was on TV, married couples didn't even sleep in the same bed on television. It's like the Brady Bunch or something. I forget exactly when a married couple could actually be portrayed on television sleeping in the same bed. Look where we've come from there. Look how far we've come. And these things that are thrust at us through a complicit, completely morally corrupt media, by design, because it's there to socially engineer us all. That's what Hollywood and television and all these things are there for. They're owned by a very small group of very powerful corporations. But the first time you see a thing and it's shocking, if you're shown that thing over and over, the shock goes away, doesn't it? And then pretty soon it's just another thing that you see all the time. But the first time you saw it, it was disturbing. It was shocking. Your common sense was still intact. But once you keep being exposed to it over and over and over, your common sense jumps in the backseat, your shock is diluted, and it just becomes the way things are. And this, repetition is absolutely one of the core attributes of media, television, Hollywood, movies, the internet, and it is, in fact, a form of marketing. And as I stated earlier, anyone who logically looks at marketing is looking at manipulation and dishonesty. By its nature, marketing is attempting to get a human being to take an action it would not have taken otherwise.
Yeah, we just got to put on those freaking sunglasses, man. See what the world actually is. So what can people do to prevent themselves from being desensitized by all this bombardment that we face every single day?
One of the main things is you need to get away from your television. Your television is the most damaging thing of the modern era. And as I stated before, the Tavistock Institute pointed out, here we come, we're the premier social engineers of this world, and we're going to have a tough time with what we called the greatest generation, the people of World War II, because they have not been exposed to TV to any great degree. One of the people was quoted as saying, "I could control the world, just give me control of television." People do not understand how damaging television is. They do not understand that it's not just the content or the act or the storylines. It's the frequencies, the color, the effects. Very few people are aware that an habitual television watcher, their brain is being affected the same way as literally as an opiate affects their brains. A habitual television watcher, within just a few seconds of going back to the television, will go into brain waves that resemble a sleep pattern. But the problem with it is it pulls you into your lower mind. And that portion of your lower mind is incapable of making decisions and just starts to accept everything as reality. But there's all these sneaky tricks, like here's one, the 3-second cut. Whenever you're watching something and you notice they're doing scene cuts within 3 seconds and they keep doing it, that's a tactic. What it's doing is presenting images that your brain doesn't have enough time to decide whether it likes it or not. And if this keeps happening over and over and over, eventually your brain just gives up and you go into a zone state and you drop into your lower mind. And in that lower mind, you're incapable of making adult decisions anymore. And that sets aside all the intended social programming and gender confusion and all the things that are currently being jammed in television with intent.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that, growing up, my dad always said, the point of television is not to entertain you, it's to sell you something. And then as we kind of grew in our knowledge and understanding of what television was, the point is to indoctrinate you with some sort of idea that you wouldn't have come to on your own. And you can see that with the way that, like you said, the alpha brainwaves kind of puts you into a mind control state, ready to accept things that are just absolutely anti what nature is supposed to be. And so yeah, definitely turn off the television. I'm glad to see the statistics of people having cable in their house go down. It's being replaced by things that maybe aren't so great either, but that's at least some sort of progress that we can be appreciative of. And so no TV. Give us just a couple more steps that people can take to go against this indoctrination.
Well, the first thing is understand there is no news. I often cover it to say that the word news actually is broken down to demonstrate what's happening to your mind. The word news means north, east, west, south. That's the directions your mind is being pulled in, and there's no destination. It's just endlessly pulled in these random directions to nowhere. But to get back to the idea of television, modern TVs will have a hertz rate listed on the back of them that's well over 100 for many TVs now. When I was young, hertz was called cycles. By the way, words have meaning. Is there a reason we call it hertz? Does that sound like something that's good for us? But the point I would make is if you had a TV that was 100 hertz, that means every second the image is flashing in your face 100 times. And this is rife, fertile fields for social engineering, for sigils, for subliminal programming, for flicker rates, for certain frequencies that are known to have certain effects, all these kinds of things. The most important thing for a burgeoning person who no longer wants to sleep is to ditch your television and understand right now that politics is a charade. It is a game being played by actors. They are controlled. They are bought and paid for. You play no role in seating them. And not only that, everyone was taught the truth in high school. They just conveniently forgot what seats a president. Do you remember what seats a president? It's the Electoral College. All these people that go out and vote for president have never once in the history of this country sat a president. And by the way, George Washington wasn't the first president. There were quite a number before him. Anyone can look it up. But my point here is, when you first heard Obama come on the news for the first time, it was like, oh, here's this promising senator. At no time did the people pick him. At no time did the people play a role in elevating him for a presidential race. And all those people that went out and voted basically did nothing, because it is the Electoral College, and that is a rigged game that seats the president. And the proof of that is even in I don't watch politics at all, but I was told Trump was seated against the popular vote. So what does that tell you? He's not the only one. There are plenty of presidents who have been seated against the popular vote. The popular vote is the will of the people. But what's happening is the Electoral College is seating them anyhow. They don't give a darn what the popular vote is, because everybody knows, they've been told since high school, that Electoral College vote seats a president. And that's a tough thing for people to get over, because they just don't want to believe it. They want to believe what they've been told is true. Well, I go out and vote. I participate. I'm sorry to tell you, that's not true. So politics, news, TV, you divorce these things from your life, you start to get back to the complex human being you were when you were put here in this world. And you can, again, nurture the unique abilities, your God-given abilities, if you will. But until you break free of basically the devil's tools here, because that's what we're talking about. These are tools of ill intent. Our political system was taken over so long ago that you probably don't have a family tree long enough to remember when this country was still under common law. This law and Canada were both formed under common law. To this day, when you're drug into a court, very few people understand what's going on there. It's commerce. Some people call it admiralty law or lex mercatoria. Basically, it is a place of business doing business. That is the corruption that we currently live in. And the idea behind all the so-called truth movements is to get back to some sane semblance of a world. And at the same time, we have the most powerful, oldest families in this world and the remaining royalty doing every damn thing they can to hold us all down, to prevent us from spiritually ascending the ladder, which is our birthright, and from growing up, basically, to be a fully functioning adult human being, which is a powerful thing, by the way. And that's what so much of the social engineering is designed to keep us all like clueless children living in fantasy.
Yeah, one thing that I really have a hard time finding the balance with is one, I hear what you're saying when it comes to, you have to cut out those lies in your life because it's just a show. But at the same time, maybe it's just because this is the way I was grown up, was to be involved. It's like, if I just abandon my place in trying to correct what our government has become, doesn't that just give it to the enemy? Doesn't that just give them the power by saying, hey, it's so corrupt, I'm just going to give up on it? Or I don't know. That's just a hard balance for me to strike.
You make a valid point. So I think what you're saying is, well, if I just walk away and ignore them, they'll get away with murder. Well, yeah. The first thing I would point out is they're already getting away with murder. But just because you don't drool in front of your television doesn't mean you can't actively work against what you see going on. There are people, the next show that we have on Crrow777 Radio will be solutions on how to deal with when you're hauled into court or someone wants to put a smart meter on your home, or 5G networks, people who have figured out the law system for what it is and going in and using the rules of that system to affect change. But as far as your government, there is no fixing it. It's got to go away, or something massive has to change. Very few people are away, like Hillary and Trump. Did you know that Hillary and Trump are from the same royal Scottish bloodline? Didn't even matter which one of them was put in. The same things were going to be done. We can go all the way back to Jimmy Carter. He started stacking the federal government with trilateral commission members. That's when the real damage started being done in the open. But was Carter different than the next guy? No, because he did the same thing. And then the Republican after him, and then the Democrat after him, they all did the same thing. And while they give the appearance with their dark, hidden, acting ways, they're all pushing the same agenda forward, which is one world control. So you've got to understand that following politics is an absolute programming system designed to waste your life. Again, look up the speech by Montague Norman from the central banks, and you'll understand how we arrived with the political system we did. But it doesn't prevent you from working to change things for the better. But as long as you're drooling in front of CNN or Fox News, you've got a long way to go, because the human mind is not immune to what's being broadcast from that black box. It's just not.
Yeah, you want to talk about social engineering, giving someone the option of only two choices. That goes up there as one of the most obvious ones. If you're ever given only two choices, say you have to choose A or B, there's no other option, man, you better start looking for choice C, because that's the one they don't want you to choose. And that seems to be what our culture and our society is founded on, is, hey, choose A or B. And the better answer is really C, D, or E.
People have no idea. They could go back to the 50s and 60s and go on YouTube and look up what a politician looked like back then. They were portrayed as adults. Now go look. It's like a clown show. It's like everyone's been demoted to kindergarten, and these clowns are now what's acceptable. They're social engineering in spades.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are getting kind of close to the end of our show here. Is there anything that we didn't get to touch on that you find more recently have been coming up, that you've just a message that you really want to get across?
So many people lose hope, and they think that all is lost when they wake up to the reality of things, and they're just getting going to understand what common sense and an adult, complex mind can bring when you really begin to see. And then after a while, it's almost like the 5 stages of grief. But I'm here to tell you, all is not lost. And we see a lot of things from the controllers of this world that look like desperation. 5G is a good example. They can't get 5G in quick enough. They've even made laws saying you can't sue the telecommunications industry, even if your health has been damaged by what they're doing. How is that even a legal law, right? So these guys are here to supposedly govern for the people, and they're telling the people, we're doing all these things that could hurt you, and you have no recourse. So these are acts of desperation. The smart meters, that's all part of the technocracy. This artificial world that I mentioned, where technology seeks to replace the natural world that was created however it was created, that we can see is apparently perfect from our point of view. This artificial world is seeking to replace it for total control. But each of us can stand up and simply by doing one thing, changing our minds, we have done something. Once one human mind changes, then there is the possibility for the human mind next to that mind, or the family, or others with an interest. You'll find it's almost like a virus, but a good one. And that facilitates change. But more than anything, you have to operate with common sense. If you see a thing that is disturbing, call it disturbing. If you hear a lie that is beyond the pale, tell everyone around you, I don't accept that for a second. Don't be pressured by groups who want to say you need to be a Republican or a Democrat. If you're confronted with that, say go look up the speech from Montague Norman and maybe learn something about what you're part of. And above all, don't contend with people who don't think the way you do. Those people, we need them. We need all the human beings around us that were put in this world. So this idea that if we don't agree, we're at odds, that is another thing that needs to be shoved aside. After all, if you were walking down the street and you saw someone drowning, would you just keep walking? What would you do? You'd stop. You'd go help. Well, those people that can't see yet, in a sense, they are drowning. They're drowning in the programming. They're drowning in the complete moral bankruptcy of this artificial system that is being pushed at us. So just know that all is not lost here. You know, it just isn't.
Yeah, so true. Well said. Crrow777, where can people find you? How can they support you? And what do you have coming up next? You said you had a movie coming up April 5th.
Right. So on YouTube, I'm Crrow777. That is CRROW777. My main place online is my private website, where we are fighting tooth and nail to make sure free speech does not die. And that is Crrow777radio.com. That's where we have the podcast. The first hour is free to everyone. If they want to support us, become a member, and you're supporting the Free Speech Zone. And as I mentioned earlier, my co-host Jason Lindgren has put together a film that's just about 2 hours now, and it outlines everything that happened from the point I filmed the lunar wave up to near present, and that will be released on April 5th. So those are all the places. And also on Teespring, we just put up T-shirts and things like that. We weren't going to do it, but the censorship online has become so overwhelming that we're doing everything. And those T-shirts get our web address out into the world where search engines can't blacklist us. I'm also Crrow777 on Twitter, and Jason, my co-host, and his girlfriend run the Facebook site Crrow777 Radio. So those are all the places.
Definitely, guys, go make sure you check out all those links and the movie coming out April 5th, Shoot the Moon. Crrow, thank you so much for coming on the Sharpening Report. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure. Nice to have met you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's our show this week, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, it's okay to talk to people who have different beliefs than you. Crrow and I definitely come from a different background, but we are both pursuing truth at all costs, and we're using our common sense and having a good discussion about what the world actually is. And that's what it's going to take, is people using their strengths, using their gifts to come together and work together. And if you can't do that, then you're fighting for the wrong thing. You're fighting against the wrong people. Don't believe everything you're told. Do your own research. Guys, I'm not going to ask you to like, subscribe, or share, but I appreciate if you do. Hope you enjoyed the show, and I hope that you have a great week.